Steph, welcome to Reset.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So good to have you here. So I'm going to read this out to make sure I get it right.
Yes.
So Steph, you are the co-founder and partner at Richardson Murray Family Law. Mm-hmm. You are also Queensland Law Society accredited specialist in family law. And we're diving deep today to talk about all things divorce.
Yes, and fortunately I'm an expert, or fortunately for many people, I'm an expert in that area.
Yeah, I feel like it's a topic that is not spoken about enough until people get into a situation that is very uncomfortable, very unknown, and quite overwhelming, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most stressful things people would go through in their lifetime. Hopefully people don't go through it, and if you do, hopefully you only have to go through it once. And ideally, we're there to guide you to make it as easy as it can be, or smooth as it can be, with the least amount of damage being left in the wake.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a bit of a stigma about the word divorce, but like anything in life, knowing when to leave something that's no longer serving you, whether it's a job, a friendship, a city, a relationship, is actually a skill that I think should be celebrated, because what kind of a life is it if you get to 95 years old and you've spent majority of that time with someone that's no longer helping you grow into the best version of yourself?
I totally agree. Actually, I was reading a statistic this week that was saying that something like 50% of the current divorces going through the system have been married for 20 years or more, which is a significant period of your life. And it's a significant period of your life to make such a huge change. So I think that's really interesting. And I think as the years have gone on and it becomes more socially acceptable to divorce or leave a relationship that's no longer serving you, those statistics would hopefully go down and people get more comfortable with doing what's right for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking percentages, what percentage of Australians' relationships do end in divorce these days?
The most recent statistic is from 2021, I think, when the last census was done. And it doesn't have an exact statistic, but it is around, I think, 47%. And interestingly, over the last few decades, that has decreased. And the reason is because more people are in a de facto relationship, not getting married. And so it's not actually reflective of the number of people going through, let's say, a separation or the ending of a relationship versus the actual legal divorce, which is the systematic process you have to go through.
Very interesting, and great to have that kind of insight as to why the stat is the way it is.
I know, because it can give an illusion that more people are staying together, which is probably not accurate at all.
Yeah, I feel like whenever I talk to my friends about relationships, it's almost an element of luck involved, because as you grow through life, you change as an individual. So the person that you started dating or that you married is going to be a different version of themselves as you go through life, and so are you. And so I think pushing that stigma aside again, are you growing in the same direction, and are you still compatible at all those different phases of your life?
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I mean, I know that from personal relationships that I've had where I've changed and grown. And I think sometimes what happens is people are on the train, if you will, and they don't know how to get off. And so they can see that it's all the red flags and all the things that are not serving them and whatever else. And you see it all the time with people in the news all the time, like celebrities and influencers, that they had this wedding, the giant wedding, and then within 12 months the relationship's over. And they all say the same thing, which is, we probably knew 2 years ago. But when you're on the train, you're engaged, you're moving forward, etc., it can be really hard to make the call as to when is the appropriate time to jump off and to trust your instincts versus everything else that's going on around you.
Absolutely. And I think it's those societal pressures of what we should do rather than like hitting pause for a minute and working out like, well, what do I actually want to do? And that's not just with relationships, that's with all aspects of life. But what is the actual process of going through a divorce?
Yeah, so if you're married and you want to get divorced, the law in Australia says you have to be separated for 12 months before you're allowed to apply for divorce, and that's to allow for reconciliation and not being in the business of just signing off on divorces. It's actually quite a process. So you wait 12 months, you make the application for a divorce. You can either do that on your own or you can do it jointly as a couple, which can be perceived to be a little more amicable. That gets filed, and then there's a hearing at the court, which is very procedural. There's no pointing the finger. There's no one's on the witness stand. It's nothing like that. It's very procedural. And if they're satisfied that you've been separated for 12 months, then the relationship's over and the divorce order is issued. If you're in a de facto relationship, it's far more simple, which is simply, I say, I no longer want to be here. This relationship from my perspective is over. You then separate, and that's all the legal separation you need to do.
Does everyone need a lawyer to go through a divorce?
It's a very good question. No, you don't. You can absolutely self-act. I'm biased in that as a lawyer. I think that the benefit of getting advice as to everything from the process to what maybe you're entitled to what you should consider or think about is really important. That's not to say everyone needs to run out and spend tens of thousands of dollars on a lawyer, but I do think it is of benefit to be able to know where you stand, know what's happening, and then make the choice to proceed. And people come in all the time for initial appointments and kind of are like, I don't want to blow anything up. I don't want them to know I've seen a lawyer. But I say, I'm not here to blow things up. I'm just here to guide you. And if you want to be amicable, that's amazing. That's what we support. How do we best do that to be able to transition you through this phase?
It sounds like it would just, like anything, if you invest in some professional support, it just makes it a whole lot less stressful.
Absolutely. And even just the process, the procedural forms, all of those kinds of things, they can be really overwhelming. And it can be as simple as you didn't tick this box or you didn't attach this certificate, so we don't accept your application for a divorce. And it can, I had a client recently, she said that she tried 3 times to file it and it had been rejected. And so the benefit of having that us is that we go, well, we dot our I's, we cross our T's, we know what needs to get across the line. So if time and stress is of the importance, it can be of benefit to just pay the money and to have the lawyer prepare it and do it all for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And then I know in Australia now, superannuation is one of the things that is considered during separations, which I think wasn't previously, correct me if I'm wrong, but is everything that you own on the table during a divorce, or how does that work?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. Everything that is in my name, your name, joint names, all held by a company or trust that is controlled by one of the parties to a marriage or a relationship is in the pool. Accountants have been trying for many years to find avenues to avoid that, to circumvent that. I guess the clearest way to explain it is for a lot of business people and tax strategies and whatever else, assets can be structured in a certain way for asset protection. Under the Family Law Act, that protection is waived. And the reason for that is because obviously there are some relationships where one person financially controls everything and the other person doesn't. And for asset protection and tax planning and all sorts of things, it just is the safest way to ensure that both parties are protected and that one party isn't going to be left with next to nothing because one party has better structuring or a better accountant or and can afford an accountant, because if you're working as a teacher, you probably don't need a day-to-day accountant. So those are the kinds of things. So yes, the short answer is everything's on the table, and then it just becomes who's entitled to what at the end of that.
Okay. And I doubt that many people enter a marriage thinking, okay, this is going to end in divorce. But of those 47% that do, what are some of the common reasons marriages end in divorce?
Look, it's an interesting part of our job because in Australia, it's a no-fault policy, meaning that who did what wrong, who left the relationship, who cheated or anything, it is irrelevant. It is simply that if one person doesn't want to be in the relationship any further, the relationship can end. And so because of that, the reason for the separation will often not be necessarily determined or exposed, or some people don't even tell me. Some people volunteer it straight off the bat. But what I see is quite common is obviously cheating. That happens. That comes up frequently. Just simply growing apart is a really common one that I see all the time. And those ones are quite hard because I often find that one person comes to that decision before the other. And it's that almost that stage of grief where one person has grieved it during, and then the other person finds out and then all of a sudden has to catch up in that part of the process, which I would say, having done this for 16 years, can be really difficult for that person. And then the other person's going, why? But they knew, but I've been very clear, and it's just human nature that they haven't caught up with what's happening. Money can often be a big one, either transparency, hiding money, parenting, different styles of parenting. But they're probably the main ones, I would say.
Yeah. So it sounds like some people leave a divorce and it's just because they've grown apart. But some people find themselves in relationships that are really physically or emotionally unsafe. They might find it more difficult to come and see a lawyer.
Yeah.
Are there some resources, and we can put links in the show notes to this, that you recommend?
Yeah, we do a lot of work in the domestic violence space and working in education and prevention. One of the best resources is there's a contact number called 1-800-RESPECT, and they are a fantastic resource to be able to guide you to where you need to be, who could support you, who could help you. DVPC, which is the DV Prevention Centre, Domestic Violence Prevention Centre, and they have a heap of support people that can help you with everything from I want to leave, how do I do that, to how can I safely access funds, or how can I access accommodation. Obviously, in an emergency, always call the police, but it can also be really helpful to see a lawyer in this space before it effectively you need to flee, to understand what you're going through. I mean, a lot of people don't even realise that they sort of go, I'm terrified to leave, but I don't know why. And then as we work through it, it's, you've been a victim of domestic violence. This is what's happened. So through that process, having a lawyer be able to say, okay, well, here's what we're going to need. How do we look at not just at what happens on the day you leave, but for the next month, for the next 6 months? What are the kids doing? What are the pets doing? Where are we headed? And I think that can give, especially for someone who potentially has been more submissive in the relationship and using the word control or whatever else, it allows them for the first time in a long time some control over maybe what's going to happen next, and allowing them to own their decision and then to find their way forward. But yeah, there's wonderful resources. There's also the Women's Legal Service that is for women only, but they can really help you guide through the system as well.
Yeah, that's great. We'll definitely put links to all of that. I think that's going to be a really, it might change some lives. So thank you.
I agree.
If someone's currently planning to get married in the near future, is there anything they should proactively do to prepare for potential divorce in the future? I know it's not very sexy or romantic, but any advice?
It's so funny. People ask me this all the time, both personally and professionally. And I say, I still believe in love. It's, I'm all about the weddings. And yeah, I think it's wonderful. But I also think it is really important to consider a prenuptial agreement or a cohabitation agreement, which is the same, but if there's no intention of getting married, so simply, two people decide to move in together and sort of solidify their relationship a little more. My first tip would be it's very different to the movies that, the hour before the wedding, they're each in their room signing it and there's pressure and it's this and it's if you put on weight, then this happens or this, or if you cheat, this is the consequence. In Australia, it has to be within the realm of what is just and equitable, meaning what is a fair outcome for both parties. The benefit of doing a prenuptial agreement or a cohabitation agreement from my perspective is it's no different to starting a business with a friend or a business partner and saying, okay, we're all on the same terms now. We all know where we're going and where, what our plan is, and we all hope for the best and we all have good intentions. But what happens if this doesn't work? And how do we ensure that everyone is safe, it's fair, and that we negotiate these terms now while everyone's in a good headspace and likes each other, versus doing it when potentially there's hurt and grief and a heap of other of those emotions. And we find that has a much better outcome for everybody than if you do it on the other end. And I think it's particularly important for people who are getting married or entering a relationship when they've accumulated wealth, because it just makes it very clear. This is what I expect. This is what you expect. There's no issue in debate. It's not relying on someone who said, I promise I'll look after you, or I promise I'll do this. It's really clear. And more, the court they're being held up. They're valid. And the court's saying, well, you went to the extent of entering into this agreement. We have very strict rules in Australia about how that's done. So both parties seeing a lawyer and making sure they have advice on it. It's not just at the dinner table, we all sign it. Making sure there's full disclosure of financial assets and transparency around that. And making sure, as I said, that it's fair for everybody. And the idea is you take into account lots of contingencies. What happens if there are children? What happens if one person stops working? What happens if the asset pool declines? We consider lots of different processes and then find what's best for you and then do what's best for you. But controversial, some people find it very unromantic and not in any way sexy. But I think that for a lot of people, if they have been through it, we're seeing more and more that for the next time, they want to know what they're expected to do. Absolutely.
Let's talk kids for a second. If someone is in a relationship already, they might be married or de facto, and they're thinking about having children in the future, children change lives in so many beautiful ways. But also, is there it's like a mid-marriage prenup or some kind of agreement that's like, okay, if we're bringing children into this relationship, maybe we didn't have a prenup before, but this is going to significantly impact the lives, particularly of women. Is there any kind of agreement up front of, okay, if we have kids and then the relationship ends, here's the child support agreement, here's the schooling, like what does that look like?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And look, this is something, I mean, the one thing I should say is that the agreement can't say what will happen to the children. It can't say, it's never going to be enforced that we're going to do an equal time 50-50 or we're going to they're going to live with mum and not spend time with dad, whatever it is. They will never do that because that doesn't align with what the best interests of the children are, which is what the Family Law Act requires. But what it can do, and I've done some recently, in fact, more and more common, which say, you know, if mum's going to sacrifice her career in order to, whether that's 1 year of maternity leave or 5 years, or that is actually going to stop the career progression because of the impact it has, as we know. Therefore, what does that look like in terms of financial support? And that's becoming more and more common, absolutely, which is that they need to be compensated, I guess, whichever parent is the one who ultimately sacrifices their career. If it's the case that is going to be that you stop working or you're not able to work to the full capacity, it's becoming more and more common that are, certainly from even our staff, that both parents are actively involved. If the child's sick, it's not just mum that needs to go. It's now there are different options, but there is nearly always a default parent who is the one that has to take more hits than the other in terms of those things. And that is absolutely something that we can do if both parties agree.
Yeah, interesting. I feel like a lot of the Reset listeners are highly ambitious, career-driven, and actively deciding, do I have children or do I not? And there's no right or wrong answer there, but I think the impact on the career is a huge influence on that. So it's very interesting to hear that that's an option as well.
Yeah, and I think, again, not dissimilar to what I said before, even having the conversation and broaching these topics, because what I can find, having done so many at the other end when everything goes pear-shaped, it's, well, I would never have made those choices if I knew that I was going to sacrifice so much, and I never would have done that. And I think broaching that topic, and if ultimately one person says, look, I'm not willing to put my career on hold to do that, and the other person says I am, well, great. At least you've had a conversation and you've put in place a plan. So much of it, I guess all of relationships comes down to communication and transparency around those things. And I think in this particular instance, in having kids and what that will look like, that communication, which can be then put into the agreement, is crucial.
Yeah, you're right. And I guess permission to change your mind as you go. Like we mentioned before, you can put all the best plans in place and then reality turns out to be quite different. And so having those ongoing conversations of like, oh, okay, we thought having kids was going to be like this. It's actually like this. How do we navigate that as a team?
Yeah, I think so. And again, with parenting, there are so many times again, when everything goes really bad, where, well, they were never there and they didn't help with this, and and two people have really different potential recollections of what happened when the baby was born and what that looked like, and I think it's just having those expectations and having communication around if that changes, what does that look like, and what's working and what's not. And I think that more and more couples are getting better at it as time goes on, and there's more education around those things. But
staying on the topic of kids for a minute, because I feel like anyone I know that's gone through a divorce, the children are the messiest, saddest, hardest part. How does that get sorted?
There's a couple of different ways that can be sorted. The best way, absolutely, and the court, I've heard judges say this for over a decade, which is that the best outcome for your kids is going to be one where, as parents, the two of you decide what that looks like and then support it. Because then you own the decision, the children embrace the decision, and everyone supports it. Where I think it gets harder is when there's not agreement on that. So one parent says, I think that the arrangement should be X, Y, Z. The other parent says, I think they should be this. And that doesn't align. How does that look? Absolutely. The education and studies show the children's exposure to that, the conflict, number one, but two, what we call adult matters, which are, well, your mum does this and therefore, I have to do this. And I'm only doing this because your dad does this. That is not good. And the studies actually show it doesn't really turn the children off that parent. It makes the children anxious about it. It just makes every changeover, every time they have to go to soccer and see both parents, incredibly stressful for them. So making sure that they are protected from that conflict, the financials, child support, the whole thing is so, so important. Even to the extent of the children picking up on your or a parent's body language and reaction to the other parent is proven to have a significant impact. And so I guess to summarize, finding an agreement that works for your family is always going to be the best outcome. If you can't do that, in Australia, you are mandatorily, unless an emergency, required to attend dispute resolution, so a mediation with an expert to try and nut out what that plan looks like. And that's someone who can challenge potentially some ideas that one person might have, or it could be as simple as, well, for me, Christmas Eve is the most important thing. Is there something that you really want that I can give up for you that makes it doable? And then if that doesn't work and dispute resolution is not successful. And again, party matters can go really, really, really smooth and then all of a sudden have a hiccup. Often new partners can trigger a little, blending families. There can be lots of different trigger points, but if it all falls apart and then it doesn't, we have the court there that can make decisions. At the end of the day, the court's job is to ensure that every arrangement is in the best interest of the children. That's the only thing that they focus on, and that they have to consider in the children having a relationship with both parents and external family, siblings, grandparents, etc., but also weigh it up against the risk of harm and their children being harmed by the arrangement, whether that's obvious things like abuse, drug use, alcohol use, mental health, domestic violence, but it can also be the children having a certain attachment to one parent or a sibling or a pet, or it could be any of those things. So all of that gets considered in the bubble and a decision is ultimately made. And one way the court can deal with that, because when you go to court, you're asking someone who's never met your children, who never will meet your children, and only knows you from what you've put in your affidavit and or how you turn up to court. They're making a decision for your family until the child's 18. So what they do is use child psychologists and social workers to meet with the family to be able to try and come to what they think would work for the family. And if there are issues in dispute, there can be niggles or there can be bigger things. How do we navigate them? What can we do to improve that? What steps can we take to make sure that the children aren't exposed to this? And in all my years, what I've found is that people reading that report, which is often 30, 35 pages, it can be very confronting, but it can also be a real education for their own behaviour. Oh, I didn't realise when I did that it had this flow-on effect, or I didn't realise this. So it's a very long answer. I'm sure you probably didn't need it to be that long, but it's a complicated field. And at the end of the day, everyone is working towards trying to find what's in the best interest of the children. And I'm a really big believer that often, irrelevant of how far apart parents are, they both actually have the best intentions. No one wants to do something that's not in the best interest of the children. They both think what they want is in the best interest of the children, but it's just different.
Child support. one partner earns $200,000 and is only paying $20 a week child support, things like that. How is child support calculated?
Yeah. Child support's done in a separate jurisdiction, if you will, than to the Family Law Act, but it's still under our umbrella. The Child Support Agency, which is run by Human Services Australia, Centrelink, etc., is done on a formula base. So that takes into account both parties' income, how much time the children spend with each parent over a fortnight, and then what we call a self-support amount, which is that, well, as a human, I need XYZ to survive. And then they will come up with a calculation, therefore, as to how much one parent needs to pay the other. So this is a system that has been designed for the benefit of most people, what we would call, public policy. It's best for the most people, but it's not perfect. And so what can sometimes happen, even you can have an equal time arrangement where the children are spending 1 week with mum, 1 week with dad, and if one party has a higher income, they're still having to pay the other child support, which for a lot of people is crazy because, well, we're each having them equal time. There are a couple of ways that can be resolved. One is that you can go through the Child Support Agency every year when you update your tax returns and do everything, that will automatically update. Really, what we're seeing more common and preferred option is that at the outset again, or at some stage through the process, the parties have a discussion and agree on what this will look like. So, for example, we have a 50-50 arrangement. Rather than us worrying about who owes who money, etc., here's how we're going to do it. We're going to split all of the school fees. We're going to split the extracurricular activities, and then we otherwise will pay for everything as they sit. Or we're going to keep our private health insurance as a family because that's actually more cost effective than doing it separate, or we're going to do it this way. And those agreements get registered with the Child Support Agency and then become enforceable. So that can be a really good way of, again, navigating those things rather than it being a trigger event that creates animosity and conflict between people. Again, the system's not perfect. I don't think it ever will be. And in particular, if you're self-employed, you have somewhat of an ability to manipulate your income, which can create a lot of animosity between parties where, one person is earning significantly higher and paying such a small amount in child support. You can apply for a variation, you can apply for special circumstances, but it is a complex process. And I see many, many times people getting a little fed up and just wanting out of having to deal with it. And that's why private agreements are becoming more and more popular.
I'm learning so much, and I'm sure everyone listening is learning as well. I don't know if this is true. It's one of those things that just gets thrown around as a statement. But if you live with someone in Australia as a de facto for 6 months or more, is it true that when you break up, you can take half their things? Like, that's the kind of throwaway line. Yeah. I don't know anyone that's ever done that, but is that actually a thing?
It's not a thing. I also have people, even my mother-in-law, she'll say, oh, well, he can take everything. And I say, where did you learn that? I don't know. But I think it is one of those myths, if you will, about family law that pop up. In Australia, under the Family Law Act, the law says that if a property adjustment, being if one person needs to pay the other person something, there is a whole list of criteria set out that gives the opportunity to do that. One of them being a minimum period of 2 years, so much more than your 6 months. And then sometimes it can be less than the 2 years. But if there are other criteria, such as if you have a child or children together within that period of time, which people do, if you start intermingling finances, so, we buy a house together, well, of course, we're going to need to sort that out. If you start a business together and it has significant growth and both parties have put into it. So there are all of those factors. Now, if someone's entitled to make a claim because of one of those factors, the 2 years, the children, intermingling of finances, etc., that also doesn't immediately mean 50%. There is a process that they follow. It's far too convoluted to go in now, other than to say they look at what the asset pool is, what the contributions of each party have been financially and non-financially, whether there are other factors that are set out in the Family Law Act, which include things like who will have the care of the children, what is the income earning capacity of both parties, that kind of thing. And then at the end, the final step is it fair? And so it is absolutely not the case. If someone was in a relationship for 18 months, someone moves into their home and hasn't contributed in any way, then they're probably not going to be successful in an application. The way that I frame it to most of my clients is more so around have that discussion up front and consider a cohabitation agreement rather than having that conversation at 22 months in going, oh, do I need to do this or do I not? Because that's more likely to lead to issues than if you have those kind of conversations up front. I'm very much an advocate for making sure that's sorted before you move in together. Again, not very romantic, but I think it can avoid a lot of hiccups in the future.
It sounds like you and your team obviously are experts in the law, but also double as psychologists and relationship counselors, helping people just navigate some things that we might suppress or just not talk about until it absolutely explodes and hits us in the face.
I think that's super true. And I graduated uni in 2008, so a very long time ago, but we didn't know courses on, psychology or interactions or even how to manage vicarious trauma or all of the things that, as certainly in family law, our team deal with every day, because it is something that you have to take a lot on and you have to set personal boundaries. And I'm seeing in our junior lawyers, the biggest mentoring lesson we can kind of give them, putting aside skills, is about those things. It's when to step back. It's when to put in place those boundaries and making sure that you're not being exposed. Because sometimes when all you do all day is hear all the negative things, all the conflict, you go home to your own life and you go, I don't want to talk to anybody. I just want to, curl up in a ball and watch TV or whatever. So I think it is really important. And I hope it's something that as young lawyers are going through their training and education, that it's something that is considered a lot more because it is hugely relevant.
Yeah. And I've been to your practice, met your team. We've done some workshops in the past.
Yep.
So I know that you definitely put the mental and physical health of your team as a top priority.
Yes.
What about yourself though? What's your go-to way of hitting the reset button when it's just been hectic?
Yeah, I think it's something, my business partner Anton and I are so passionate about our team having those boundaries. I think it's something that I didn't have at the start of my career, and it was a different era. It was a different era in the law. It wasn't a priority, mental health and boundaries and those kinds of things. So it's something Anton and I are really passionate about, making sure that our team have those resources, employee wellness programs, and it's something that we get a lot of positive feedback on. But for myself, it's a skill I've developed over time. I'm not perfect at it. I think it's something we need to work on all the time. I think one of the things that I have gotten really good at is knowing when I need a minute. So you can be going, everything's fine. And then all of a sudden something happens and you go, this isn't even that big of a deal. And my reaction doesn't match what's happening. And it's often at those times that I need to take a step back. And there are various things that I do. One is that Anton and I have a very open relationship about those sorts of things. And so he will often be the first person I'll say, hey, I'm actually really struggling because of all of these things, and I think it's just been a bit much and I need a minute. So that's a big one for us. I'm an advocate for regular therapy, which is something that I do monthly, whether there's anything going on or not, which I have found since I changed from going when I needed it to regularly has made a very significant impact in my life. I can't stress that enough. I think it's been a game changer for me. Exercise is absolutely crucial for me again. And otherwise, lots of mindfulness. I pick up my phone and I start scrolling, and then, people close to me would say, maybe that's enough, put your phone away. And I try and do things like color or whatever it is, but they're really the things that I've put in place. Interestingly, when I consider all these tips and tricks, and I love listening to podcasts and getting, wellness things from everywhere. A big thing for my therapist was, as a high performer, she was like, the last thing you need is to add 5 more things per day into your agenda. How are you actually going to manage that? Yes, it's great in theory, but it just adds to what's on your plate. What we're trying to do is take things off your plate and so you can recover. And I think that was such good advice. I'm not a journaler because it's just another thing for me to do. And so I find other ways that I can look after myself without necessarily having to do every one of those things that all of the things recommend. And, I think it's one of those things as the seasons change as well. is really, really important to make sure that maybe that works for me for that period and maybe it doesn't for this. But I try not to be too hard on myself about those things.
Yeah, beautiful. I think that's self-awareness and permission to lean into whatever season you're in that particular part of your life. I think a lot of people listening can probably relate to that classic high performer. And I see this at retreats all the time. They know that they need to take a break, so they book into the retreat because otherwise they won't do it otherwise. But it can be super uncomfortable when your default mode and your comfort zone is to be super busy all the time, to suddenly just be still with your thoughts, with your body, with your mind. It can be such an adjustment. So yeah, I think we all struggle with that at different times.
I agree. And something we've actually implemented in our office in the last couple of months, which has taken off like no other, which you wouldn't believe, is puzzling. We have like a giant puzzle board in the middle of our kitchen and whoever can just come and play. And I think one of the benefits of that I've noticed is that if that person is in the middle of something, and sometimes as a lawyer you can really get in your head and, am I doing this? Should I do this? Have I done with that? Or, you're waiting for a response to the other side. Putting aside 10 minutes, going and doing that can be the best way rather than sitting at your desk, becoming overwhelmed, burning yourself out. The anxiety of all of that is really hard. So, yeah, I think anything that we can do like that, Lego, puzzles, even walks, we're so lucky to be in Broadbeach, so our team can go to the beach at lunch and anything like that, we are very supportive of, because I think that is so important, is having those opportunities to clear your mind during the day.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And congratulations to you and Anton for knowing that the culture that you started in wasn't the one that you wanted to continue when you opened your own practice, and really taking that blank canvas and designing it to be an environment where your team can thrive. That's huge.
Yeah, I think so. And look, not everyone is into it. Some people find it a bit, I'd rather just work, I'd rather just do this. And our thing is, if you don't want to participate, then you don't need to. But the opportunity's there. And when I feel most proud is sometimes those people that are reluctant, when I see them all of a sudden engage with something. And I think it is sort of different things for different people. It makes me really happy that they're finding something that really works for them, and therefore we can have an impact in a positive way on that person.
If someone's thinking about transitioning into the world of law as a career, whether it's family law or not, what advice would you have for them?
It's a very good question. I think that having mentors in the space is really important. I think it's something when I was a junior I didn't have. And when I took steps to find one, and there are programs, the unis have programs, the Queensland Law Society or even our Gold Coast District Lawyers Association have programs. I found that is such a game changer because it allows the things that you're feeling where certainly I felt, and I can recognise in our young lawyers that they feel that they're really alone, that they're the first person who's gone through this. Oh, I've made a mistake. It's going to cost us all of this money, or the client's going to leave us, or, and the human mistakes. First of all, that's not the first time that's ever happened. Number two, most of the time, like 99% of the time, everything's fixable. And I think that having either a boss or a senior mentor or someone you can go to that reminds you that the world is not all on your shoulders, you're not alone, for me is everything. And we get heaps of that feedback from our team as well, because we try and say, come to us when you're feeling like this, and come to us and talk about it. You're going to have a much better outcome than if you stay where you are. So that's my first advice. The second thing I think is that if you don't know what area of law you want to get into, and even if you do, try other things and see what fits. I think when I was a baby coming out of uni, I had these dreams of being, some sexy mergers and acquisitions lawyer that was going to take over the world. I ended up getting a job in family law, and it was so perfect for me. And it is something now that I couldn't fathom sitting at a desk all day doing mergers and acquisitions or corporate law. You get no client interaction. You don't ever get to appear in court versus all of the exposure that I get in my role. But there are some people that would hate family law that love the idea of that. And I really, truly think trying a few areas and seeing what works for you is really important.
Great advice. And is there anything we haven't spoken about today that you think more people should know, particularly around navigating divorce and relationships?
Yeah, probably the only thing I would say is that I find if you are considering separation or you're feeling overwhelmed, and it's one of these areas of the world where everyone has an opinion. And so if you go out with your girlfriends and you're talking about it, everyone's going to be telling you things and it can be a bit overwhelming and you don't know what's true, what's not, whether they've given you any correct advice, if it's helpful or what it otherwise looks like. And I think that if you are thinking about leaving a relationship, getting advice from a lawyer, even if you haven't left, it's confidential, judgment-free, everything's private, no one will ever know you've been, can be so helpful to making sure that when you're making the decision to stay or to not or what it looks like, you have all of the facts and you have all the details and everything you need. And some people might say that that's underhanded or manipulative, but from my perspective, I think it can be so helpful because that person then can go back into their relationship, and many stay. Many reconcile and stay and figure it out. And that's probably something I haven't said, which is that in our first appointment, we always say, are you sure? Do you feel like you can reconcile? Have you considered counselling? Do you want a referral to someone? We work with counsellors all the time. We encourage that. But you can go back into that relationship. And if you ultimately decide to separate, well, that's fine. You have all of your information and you can prepare. And if you don't and you end up staying together, well, then you still have the comfort of knowing that information in the back of your mind. And I think in particular for women who maybe haven't been the controlling person within the relationship or necessarily had control of their finances, or even in awful circumstances, people get told, well, you'll get nothing. You'll have nowhere to live. You'll be living with your mum in wherever. I think getting answers to those things before you make the decision so that you can make the decision with all of the facts is just going to be such a better time for you. I have people come in and say, oh, they've said I'm going to get nothing. They've said that this isn't worth anything, that they're going to get this. And, within an hour, I'm like, that's not going to be the outcome. But it's the other person often's fear response that they say, well, this is going to be the outcome. And so I do think that it would be very beneficial for a lot of people having those discussions before any form of separation, just to know where you're sitting, where you stand, have some comfort, have some knowledge. And then if you decide to proceed, we can proceed. And if not, then that's wonderful for everyone.
I think that's such good advice because otherwise, like you said, you're asking your girlfriends, you're on Google, you're scrolling Instagram, and it's just bombarding of misinformation and chaos. And so just speaking to a professional, like you said, it doesn't mean the relationship's ending, but it's just getting actual knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And the number of people that say, oh, my friend's mum told me that this happened. Why haven't you told me that? And I'm like, because that's not relevant here, or whatever it is. And I'm sure doctors go through it all the time as well. But I just think it can really eliminate a heap of anxiety around the what ifs, give you the information you need and allow you to prepare yourself, look at your bank statements, make sure that you know where everything's sitting, have an understanding, and then make a plan, and not having that hover over you as the reason why you can or can't do something.
Steph, thank you so much for your time today.
It's my absolute pleasure. It's been a blast.
I feel like everyone's going to come away learning a lot more, and I'm going to put the links in the show notes of how to reach out to you and your team if they want some professional advice. Thank you again for being on Reset.
My pleasure. It was lovely to be here. Thank you.